Welcome to the Socratic Club. The Gonzaga Socratic Club has been in existence for, I think this is the 8th year. I should check, but I think this is the 8th year of the Socratic's existence. We are named the Gonzaga Socratic Club in honor and recognition of the Oxford Socratic Club, which was an organization devoted to following the argument wherever it may lead, especially with respect to issues Christian. It was formed on the campus of Oxford University, and its first president, indeed the president for almost its entire public existence, was the famous Christian apologist C.S. Lewis. And our intention here is to follow that lead of pursuing Christian worldview issues from a philosophical or argumentative point of view. And that's the spirit in which we are looking today at the question, what is so great about Albert? There's a long story. I'd like to rob our speaker of his time, but I won't do that. There's a long and complicated story about the amazing transition or transportation of the works of Aristotle from ancient Greece to Byzantium to Persia into the hands of Muslim scholars and translators, and then from there through exchanges having to do somewhat with the Crusades, and then with intellectual exchanges between the Christian Latin West and Muslims. And finally, the works of Aristotle were brought back to the West, and from there to Latin Europe. It's an amazing story. I just gave you a sketch of it, but what we want to do is follow that story in the last steps, because as the works of Aristotle were reintroduced to Europe and to the Mediterranean basin, a revolution occurred. And our speaker today is going to tell us about that revolution and the role of one particular person in those revolutionary changes that took place. Our speaker, Dr. Michael Tkacz, is certainly a fixture around here at Gonzaga University. Most of you know him, and in the community. He received degrees from Valparaiso University and from the a master's in medieval studies from Notre Dame, and also went from there to the Catholic University of America, and he's been at Gonzaga since 1991 in the philosophy department. So if you would, welcome Dr. Michael Tkacz.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be able to kick off this semester's Socratic Club presentations with a that is not well known, but maybe a little more attention. On the other hand, it's something that everyone seems to have a little bit of a sense of. In fact, some years ago, the great historian of all things medieval, Etienne Gilson, pointed out that Albert the Great is far less known than he is celebrated. Indeed, today, if Albert's known at all, it's as the teacher of this man, Thomas Aquinas. Yet this was not the situation in Albert's own day, when his fame was far greater than that of his fellow Dominican, Thomas. While Thomas was still a young theologian and relatively little known, teaching at the University of Paris, Albert already bore the title of Magnus, the Great, on account of his great learning. For an indication of just how rare such a distinction was in those days, we need only consult the published comments of that great gossip of the 13th century, Roger Bacon, this fellow here. With clear outrage and perhaps a bit of envy, Bacon complained that most students, and even some very learned men, consider that the complete contents of philosophy in fully developed form have already been handed down in the Latin language by a man who is considered as much an authority as Avicenna, Averroes, and Aristotle himself, even though this man is still alive. Clearly an absolutely unprecedented indecency. Envy indeed. Whatever Friar Bacon's complaints, there was no denying Albert's great learning and his substantial contributions to the intellectual life of his time. Many today have some vague sense of this, even though, as Professor Gilson pointed out, few know exactly what those contributions are. My task this afternoon is to tell you a story. The story of just who this much celebrated and yet little known man was, and why he earned so much respect in his own time, and why he is continued to be honored today. A quick look at Albert's curriculum vitae is hardly sufficient to convey the accomplishments of such a full life, but it does tell us something. I mean, if you look, you see that he was a well-educated man, holding several university degrees, including an advanced degree. He held a number of important academic appointments. He also had a number of important ecclesiastical appointments. He was honored not only in his own day, but subsequently. I didn't include a list of his publications, which would have taken up far too much space on my hard drive. But depending on how you count them, Albert published over 100 works during his lifetime. So a full and productive life indeed. The essence of my story here today begins in the year 1249. That was the year marked by an important event in Albert's intellectual career, and as we shall soon see, in intellectual history as well. It was the year that Albert finally acceded to the pleas of his Dominican confreres to compose a work explaining the natural science of Aristotle. Now I should explain to you that Albert was a member of the order of preachers, right, commonly known as the Dominicans, just as his student Thomas Aquinas was. And when Albert was a professor at the University of Paris, the younger Dominicans who were studying theology there kept pestering him to write a kind of introduction to natural science based on the works of Aristotle. Well, this event, as it turns out, was of great significance both in Albert's personal intellectual career and for the intellectual development of Western civilization. The brothers had been imploring him to write such a book for a good many years while he was a professor of theology at the University of Paris. Albert had come to Paris in 1243 to lecture on the theological sententiae of Peter Lombard. He was living at the Priory of Saint-Jacques in the University District of Paris. We now know it as the Latin Quarter. It's across the river from the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The Priory is long gone. But that's where it was. And Albert was living there and studying theology under the direction of Guéric of Saint-Quentin, who held one of the Dominican professorships in theology. In 1245, Albert succeeded Guéric and held his chair until 1248, and it was during that time, when Albert would have been giving regular lectures on the scriptures, that his young confreres began to ask him to compose an introduction to Aristotle's books on the study of nature. Clearly, Albert already had a reputation as an expert in the natural sciences. Well, Albert managed to put off his brothers for 3 years until the Dominican Master General ordered him to resign his professorship at Paris and proceed to Cologne to establish a school of theology there. Thus, in the hot, dusty summer of 1248, Albert, accompanied by a small band of Dominican friars that included the young Thomas Aquinas, made their way on foot along the old Roman road flanking the Rhine River to the Priory of the Holy Cross in Cologne. It was during the following year, 1249, that Albert began work on the long-requested guide to Aristotle's books on the sciences of nature. So here we have a sort of a summary of the events I just mentioned. In 1243, Albert comes to Paris to attend the university, where he works on his bachelor's in theology. He already had a bachelor's degree in arts from the University of Tkacz. We'll talk about that later. But he worked on a bachelor's in theology and then a master of theology. Giving his inaugural lectures on the theological sententiae, or opinions, of Peter Lombard, the standard inaugural lecture for theologians at the University of Paris. In 1245, he succeeds his teacher as Regent Master of Theology. Regent Master in medieval universities is equivalent to an endowed professorship in modern universities. Friar Thomas Aquinas arrives at Sanjak in 1245 to study with Albert. Albert published his master's thesis, these lectures on the sentences of Peter Lombard, under the title De Summa Parisiensis in 1246. He gave a famous series of lectures on an important theological text, the so-called Pseudo-Dionysian text. And in 1248, he resigns his professorship in order to proceed to Cologne to establish a theological studium for the Dominicans, which was the first institution of higher education in Germany. And indeed, Germans today continue to honor Albert as the founder of German higher education. In 1249, he publishes his Physica, right, which is the book that his confreres have been asking him to publish. It's a commentary on Aristotle's treatise on the principles of nature that we commonly call the Physics today. Albert, when he was at Cologne, in addition to the usual lectures on the scriptures and on the church fathers, also lectured on Aristotle's Ethics in a new translation that was made available during the time Albert was there. And he got a hold of it and gave a series of lectures. These are, he later published these, these are quite famous because Thomas Aquinas essentially served as his graduate assistant. Right? In medieval universities, when a master lectured on a topic, very often he would assign one or two of his best students to serve as a reporter. And that student would take down notes, what the master said. Later the master would edit these and they'd become the basis for the published version of the lectures. These would be published under the master's name, and then the student reporter would be acknowledged in an acknowledgement, usually in the explicit of the book. Albert also lectured on a number of Aristotle's other works on the sciences of nature. Works on cosmology, on the elements, on change, chemical change, on atmospheric studies, and on zoology as well. did the friars know that they're pleased for an introductory textbook on Aristotle's natural science were to set in motion a momentous intellectual development. The work that Albert initially produced was a paraphrastic commentary on Aristotle's physics. Yet what he was setting out to do was actually quite far-reaching, for he intended this commentary as the first part of what would become one of the major literary productions of the Middle Ages, a production upon which his later reputation as the foremost expert on Aristotle, as well as on the empirical sciences, would rest. The significance of this event lies in the fact that Albert, who had been trained in theology and mandated by his religious superiors to prepare young men to take up the sacred sciences, had in addition decided to devote himself to the long-term project of pursuing the natural sciences. That this is the meaning of his accession to his confrere's wishes is clear from the beginning of his commentary, where he declares that he is setting out to make the new learning of Aristotle intelligible to Latin readers. Indeed, Albert's plan was far more ambitious than his Dominican students could have imagined. He intended not merely to produce an elementary guide to Aristotle's physics, a basic work on the principles of nature, nor simply a compendium of the natural sciences as then known, but to compose a systematic and learned treatment of the whole of human knowledge. He would accomplish this most ambitious of all intellectual undertakings by rewriting the whole of the new Aristotelian philosophy. He would treat in orderly fashion all of the natural sciences, both inanimate and animate, mathematics, logic, rhetoric, astronomy, ethics, economics, politics, and metaphysics. Albert intended all of this from the start and carried out his plan in a deliberate and systematic way, following the order of Aristotle's books. The manuscript evidence reveals his intention. The autographed copy of Albert's commentaries on Aristotle in the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek at Vienna shows that the commentaries were written consecutively in the order of Aristotle's books as then arranged. This is folio 72 verso, and unfortunately it's not a very good scan, but at the very top of the page, where the underlining is on the top right, that's the explicit of his commentary on the physics. And what that says is explicit auctorum physicorum. So here ends the 8 books of the physics. And then immediately below that, where the rubricated D is the beginning of the very next book in the order of Aristotle's books on nature, the De Caelos, and it says De Caelo et Mundo, etc., on the heavens and the earth. This commentary on the De Caelo, treatise on the heavens, ends on folio 142 recto, and you can see the explicit is marked in the margin there by a later hand. It actually occurs right over here about the middle of the page. And immediately, Albert then takes up the next work, the next book in the series, which was the De Natura Locorum, a treatise on natural place, and continues on with the treatise on elements, the De Causis Elementorum, and so forth, all the numerous books of Aristotle on the natural sciences. Now, remember, this is an autograph, so this is Albert's own hand. Right? So this is good historical evidence that, well, this wasn't just chance or a last-minute decision to write these commentaries and set out this knowledge of the natural sciences in the order of Aristotle's books, but this was a planned program that Albert was engaged in, and he did it consecutively. Saying that Albert set out to rewrite Aristotle hardly captures the complex nature of the undertaking. True, Albert's commentaries are paraphrastic in the manner of Avicenna, the great Islamic commentator on Aristotle, rather than expository in the style of Averroes, the great, another great Islamic Moorish philosopher. This Averroistic style was later followed by Thomas Aquinas in his own Aristotelian commentaries. Albert's procedure, patterned after Avicenna, was to follow the order of Aristotle's text and restate what he found there. Among these paraphrastic passages, however, Albert inserted comments, corrections, and explanations, often quite lengthy ones. Some of these go on for many chapters, in fact. Indeed, Albert interpreted and updated Aristotle at nearly every turn. Further, Albert attempted to supply the missing parts of the body of Aristotle's writings. Knowing, for example, that Aristotle had composed a treatise on animal motion, which was not contained in the translatio vetus he was using, Albert reconstructed the work out of his own ingenuity, and of course based on what he knew from Aristotle's other works. Albert also added to the corpus a whole new science of minerals, not treated by Aristotle, but clearly needed to complete Aristotle's program of empirical studies. In addition, Albert extended Aristotle's De Animalibus, Aristotle's massive treatise on zoology, and the pseudo-Aristotelian De Plantis, a treatise on botany, with new research, including some of his own, treating those species the early Peripatetics did not know. This was clearly a comprehensively planned program, carried out deliberately and in accordance with a carefully defined understanding of the place of learning in Christian life. In order to properly understand Albert's ambitious project and its meaning, it's necessary to see it in the historical context in which it was conceived and carried out. Albert was a Swabian, born in the Danube town of Lauingen during the final year of the 12th century, 1200. He did not pursue the military profession of his father. Instead, he was sent to the university town of Padua to study the liberal arts. Indeed, the University of Padua was very young at that time, so he had to have been perhaps one of the first group of students to receive his degree there in arts. In 1223, Jordan of Saxony, Master General of the newly established Order of Preachers, the Dominicans, arrived in Padua with the purpose of recruiting among the students there. The story goes that, at least at first, Jordan found the students rather cold. Apparently, they later warmed up, for before Jordan left town, he had been approached by no fewer than 10 students seeking admission into the order. This group of candidates included 2 students from prominent military families of the German Empire, among whom clearly was Albert. By 1228, Albert had completed his novitiate at Cologne and 4 years of theological study, and was ready to be sent out as lector of theology to various Dominican priories located in German-speaking territories. The standard procedure at the time was after a year of religious discipline, novitiate year, the candidate would then take his first religious vows and then would live in the priory and work on his theological studies. Usually a young friar was assigned to an older friar under whom he who directed his theological studies. This was mostly the reading of the scriptures and selected reading from the Church Fathers. And if a student showed scholarly ability, then often the student was raised to the status of lector or reader in the priory, where he would read out loud the scriptures or readings from the church fathers to the rest of the community, either in the refectory during mealtime or in the aula during study period. And indeed, Albert performed this function as a young friar. By 1243, it was clear that to Albert's religious superiors that they had something special on their hands. Albert's learning in all of the arts as well as theology was already becoming quite obvious. Hence his subsequent education at the University of Paris and his inception as Regent Master of Theology there in 1245, followed by his establishment of the Dominican Studium Generale in Cologne in 1248. So here we have the summary of the little bit of biography that I just went through. By 1223, Albert has his bachelor's degree in arts, completes his novitiate the following year, and then spends several years in various German priories, learning theology and the life of the community. One of the interesting things during this period of Albert's life is it's clear that he already is engaged in studies in the natural science. He's already beginning to find opportunities to indulge his passion for empirical studies. His religious superiors allowed him to make several visits to the mining district of the Harz Mountains, for example, to study various minerals. And he talked to the miners to find out what was known about these various minerals. He collected samples, classified them. These are the first classificatory studies in mineralogy in Western science. We know from Albert's writings that he observed the comet of 1240 in northern Germany when he was there, and there are a number of others. I just wrote in a few here to just convey a general idea that Albert was active even during these early years of his training as a friar. And then we have the biography brings us up to where we left him in Cologne, where he publishes the first of his Aristotelian commentaries on Aristotle's natural science. Albert's training and early career must be seen against the background of two profound events that occurred in intellectual history. The first of these is the foundation of the early universities in Western Europe during the latter half of the 12th century. It must be recalled that while higher education is very ancient, universities are a medieval invention. In antiquity, advanced study was a private affair. The student who wanted to pursue higher studies personally approached a scholar of reputation, requesting to sit at his feet, as the saying went. Even when this involved travel to some locus of intellectual activity, such as those famous intellectual centers of the Roman world at Athens and Alexandria, the essential nature of the student-master relationship remained a matter of personal mentorship. Higher education did find an institutional home during the early medieval period, but in institutions that were not themselves devoted to intellectual pursuits. The monastic schools in the Christian world, the court school at Baghdad, the mosque school at Cordova in the Islamic world. Yet these institutions were not primarily intellectual institutions. They were religious or governmental institutions that had incorporated some intellectual activity among their operations. Universities were something new. For the first time in human history, there came to exist institutions, the function of which was explicitly and solely that of promoting the intellectual life. Like their modern successors, medieval universities were established as independent legal corporations of scholars and masters under the authority of civil and/or ecclesiastical government. They were thus able to devote themselves to teaching and research in the sciences and the professions in ways more comprehensive and continuous than was possible for institutions that existed primarily for the sake of carrying out a civil or religious mission. The second of the two profound historical events is the recovery in the Latin West of the books of Aristotle. This is the event that Professor Calhoun mentioned at the beginning in the introduction to our session here. As is well known, the only works of Aristotle to be found in the monastic libraries of Western Europe before the 12th century were a few logical treatises, most notably Aristotle's Categories and his book on interpretation, along with bits and pieces of his syllogistic logic. These were available in the 6th century translations of Boethius, along with his Boethius Latin commentaries and the commentary of the Greek philosopher Porphyry, which was also translated into Latin by Boethius. Latin monastic scholars knew that Aristotle had written more, but this Logica Vetus, or old logic as it was called, was all they had. During the course of the 12th century, though, this situation changed radically. Within the span of about a generation, the entire literary production of Aristotle became available in Latin translation from the Arabic and the Greek. By 1220, good working Latin versions of all of Aristotle's books were available to the faculties of the new universities. Suddenly, the whole of the Aristotelian recension, with its comprehensive treatment of all the sciences, became available for study. It was immediately apparent to Latin readers that this body of literature was primarily a natural science. Today we tend to think of Aristotle largely in philosophical terms. That is, we tend to think of Aristotle as a formal logician, an ethicist, a political theorist, a metaphysician. Yet if one looks at the whole body of Aristotle's writings, without the prejudice of our modern philosophical curriculum, one will see that in fact, the vast majority of it is devoted to empirical study in the natural sciences. Well over half the corpus is devoted to such studies. 25% is devoted to zoology alone. Masters and students in medieval universities found in Aristotle's books a naturalistic worldview supported by a large body of scientific research. Further, these books included not only updated versions of the Logica Vetus, the old logic, translations that corrected and updated Boethius' old translations, but the Logica Nova, the new logic, those logical works of Aristotle that Boethius never got around to translating. Especially important among these were two works. The works we know today as the Posterior Analytics and the Topics. These works together set out a methodology for the study of nature, which promised to uncover new scientific knowledge of nature in the future. No wonder the recovery of Aristotle's books caused so much excitement in the new universities. These books not only provided access to accounts of Aristotle's programs of empirical research, but these accounts were accompanied by a methodology that held the promise of future scientific progress. Such a naturalistic worldview and a naturalistic view of intellectual activity was in sharp contrast to the early medieval approaches to learning and philosophy, both in the Christian and Islamic world. The Christian monastic schools have been focused on elementary liberal arts education and, not surprisingly, tended to limit higher education to theological issues. The study of nature in the monasteries was limited to a few practical pursuits such as herbal medicine. The approach to philosophy in the Islamic schools was dominated by a Neoplatonic tendency to harmonize the thought of Plato and Aristotle. The differing accounts of forms given by each of these philosophers, with which we are all familiar from modern textbooks, were taken by medieval Islamic thinkers as representing distinct dialectical approaches to the same, basically Platonic ontology. The early Islamic philosopher Al-Farabi epitomizes this tendency in his famous claim that Plato and Aristotle, despite their differences, intend to offer one and the same philosophy. Again, except for medicine and certain other practical arts, the empirical study of nature was generally left undeveloped by Islamic thinkers. The sudden 12th century recovery of Aristotle's books in the Latin West, that is, roughly in Western Europe, occurred in such a way that attention was drawn to the fact that philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom, was considered by Aristotle to be largely a pursuit of empirical knowledge. At the time, this was a new idea. The result of the conjunction of these two profound historical events, the foundation of the universities and the recovery of Aristotle's works, with its emphasis on empirical studies, was nothing less than a scientific revolution. It almost immediately gave rise to the historically continuous tradition of experimental science that continues today. The medieval universities became centers for scientific research that produced a large literature, mostly in the forms of commentaries on Aristotle's books, upon which later scientists such as Galileo drew in their own experimental work. Our modern research science owes its remote origins to this medieval scientific revolution that, by the time Albert was born in 1200, was already beginning to develop. Albert became a central figure in this historical development. By the time he was studying liberal arts at Padua, that would have been in the 1220s, the recovery of Aristotle's books had already caused great excitement in the new universities. Albert, no less than many of his contemporaries, was impressed by the possibilities that Aristotle's scientific method held for future research in the natural sciences. Further, Albert became acquainted with the research that Aristotle and his early students had already done in the life sciences, the earth sciences, atmospheric sciences, and other disciplines. He realized that this body of research provided a model for how the Aristotelian methodology contained in the Logica Nova can be applied to new research programs. Albert eagerly engaged this new scientific literature, and by the time of his appointment as Regent Master of Theology at Paris in 1245, had already developed an expertise on Aristotle's natural science. Hence his confrere's request that he write something on the subject for them. Despite the fact that Albert was by profession a theologian, he had clearly determined to devote himself to a lifelong pursuit of natural science. This is confirmed by his carefully planned and conducted response to his confrere's request that took the form of a complex and ongoing project to make Aristotle's empirical researches known and to conduct his own researches advancing various scientific disciplines by application of Aristotle's scientific method. Further evidence of Albert's devotion to empirical studies as a complement to theological studies can be found in the reportaciones of his lectures given at Cologne. These not only include lectures on the scriptures and the church fathers, as one would expect in a school of theology, but also on Aristotle's ethics and even Aristotle's animal studies as well. That Albert's notion of a suitable curriculum for theological studium includes work in zoology reveals a good deal about Albert's conception of the intellectual life, as well as his attitude toward the relationship of faith and reason. This is by no means a complete list, but in the early years of Albert's many years of lecturing at Cologne, so in the curriculum that he himself had set up, these are the lectures, published lectures, that we have. We actually have many more, but I just listed these as examples. So at the time, like this would have been like one term, right? In one term, he would have been giving lectures on the books of the prophets from the Old Testament, maybe lectures on one of the Gospels, and lectures on the theological works of the early Christian thinker known today as the Pseudo-Dionysius. And at the same time, he would have been giving lectures on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, a treatise on virtue, a philosophical treatise on virtue, and Aristotle's De Animalibus, right? Aristotle's zoological treatises. And the evidence for this is quite firm and documentary in nature. So we know that indeed Albert pursued this kind of curriculum, created and carried out this kind of curriculum at Cologne. So this shows a great deal about how he approached the idea of theological studies. Remember that all his students are preparing for the priesthood. Albert was not alone in his keen interest in Aristotle's books on natural science and scientific method. At Oxford, under the intellectual leadership of Robert Grosseteste, that's Grosseteste there, a tradition of experimental science was already established before Albert went to Paris in 1243. As Chancellor of the University of Oxford and later as Bishop of Lincoln, Robert had been involved in the translation of Aristotle's books. He became personally impressed by the new science and wrote the first complete Latin commentaries on Aristotle's physics and posterior analytics. Using Aristotle's methodology, Robert did groundbreaking experimental work in optics. Many of his students did experimental work in other sciences as well as carried on Robert's work in optics as well. And indeed, it was only in the span of a generation that the optical properties of lenses were understood well enough to create magnifying glasses and reading glasses and such things, largely based on the work of Robert Grosseteste and his students. Albert knew of the work of Grosseteste and his students and made many references to it in his own scientific works. To be sure, Albert was not alone in his reception and application of Aristotle's natural science. Albert did, however, make a unique historic contribution to the revival of Aristotelian science. It is generally acknowledged that Aristotle stands at the beginning of the history of the life sciences as the originator of a program of theoretical description and explanation of animal morphologies and behaviors. His books on animals present a careful and detailed description of numerous species of animals classed in their various genera, as well as explanatory studies in animal morphology, locomotion, reproduction, and development. These books also contain a detailed treatment of scientific method and its application to zoological research. Despite the sophistication of Aristotle's animal studies, however, his research program was not continued after his death. Aristotle's student and collaborator, Theophrastus, did apply his master's methods to botanical studies, but otherwise, biology as a research discipline died out in ancient times after the deaths of Aristotle and Theophrastus. Historian of science James G. Lennox of the University of Pittsburgh has established that it was not because Aristotle's zoological treatises were lost in antiquity that this happened. They remained available and were used by Hellenistic medical scholars such as Galen. Yet no scholar takes up and develops the Aristotelian biological research program during this period. By the end of the 9th century, a complete Arabic translation was available, and it was well known at the court school of Baghdad to physicians such as Avicenna. Avicenna even wrote several commentaries on Aristotle's animal histories. Yet, again, there's no Arabic tradition of theoretical biological studies developing the Aristotelian research program. Medieval Greek scholars at Constantinople produced corrected editions of Aristotle's zoological treatises in the early 12th century, and therefore clearly knew them very well. None of these commentaries, however, pursues a program of biological research. In all this time, a period of some 1,500 years, Aristotle's zoological research program lay dormant until, that is, Albert receives it and revives it about the middle of the 13th century, explaining and extending Aristotle's original program of animal studies. Aristotle, of course, lived in the Aegean, and the species of animals that he studied and described and discusses in his zoological treatises, of course, are all Mediterranean species. Albert adds to this a large body of animal studies based on species he and others observed in Northern Europe. Remember, Albert's a German, after all, okay, and lived for a large part of his life in northern territories. Professor Lennox suggested that the history of Aristotle's zoological research program indicates that while familiarity with and even appreciation of the works of Aristotelian biology are a necessary condition for carrying on Aristotle's research program, the research program contained in these books, they're not sufficient. What is required in addition is an active and intelligent researcher who shares the theoretical aims and methods of Aristotelian science in a way that allows him to extend the research program beyond the point that it was left by its founders, Aristotle and Theophrastus. After more than a millennium, there emerges just such a researcher in the person of Albert, who, as Professor Gilson rightly pointed out, possessed in the highest degree that typical gift of the born biologist, the taste for personal observation. In Albert's massive De Animalibus, Aristotle's zoological research program is reborn. Albert not only provides detailed descriptions of and commentary on all of Aristotle's zoological studies, but adds reports of new research, including some based on his own observations and studies, extending zoological knowledge to species Aristotle did not know, like the species in Northern Europe. Albert therefore emerges as one of the medieval pioneers of empirical science that and hence is a precursor to the rise of modern science. Now, there's a great deal more to say about Albert's contributions to the foundation of the empirical science and the initiation of the ongoing tradition of experimental science that begins in Albert's day. But I'm not going to take time to go into all the details here. Indeed, we'll skip the last part of Albert's life, the biographical material. But by way of conclusion, I just want to point out that The scientific renaissance, initiated by the recovery of Aristotle's books in the Latin West, with its promise of future scientific progress, presented great challenges and opportunities to scholars of that period. Indeed, we have had time to tell only a very small part of the story here. Enough has been said, however, to demonstrate that Albert was at the center of the revolutionary intellectual developments of his time. His revival of the Aristotelian research program in the life sciences, along with some of his other contributions, not only to specific experiments that he did, but also his recovery of the Aristotelian conception of form, something of interest to you philosophers. These were crucial elements of the scientific revolution that stands as the remote origin of our modern scientific culture today. By the time of Albert's death in 1280, Albert had lived a long and productive life. Were he to have accomplished only those achievements that I outlined here, that alone would be enough to earn him his title of Magnus. In fact, there is more, much more, even if its narration must await a future presentation. Perhaps, however, enough has been said so that we can now say that Pace Professor Gilson, it is now not quite true that Albert is far less known than he is celebrated. The bit of Albert's history that has been addressed here this afternoon prompts one final comment concerning the relationship of faith and reason. Among the achievements of Albert's most talented student, Thomas Aquinas, was the demonstration that the naturalistic worldview found in the books of Aristotle, especially as interpreted by his teacher Albert, is entirely compatible with the true faith handed down in the apostolic tradition. That this goes to the heart of Albert's life and work is a point that has not been lost on the Church. It was in the dark days of World War II that Pope Pius XII declared Albert patron saint of those who devote themselves to research in the natural sciences. Since that declaration, scholarship has deepened appreciation of Albert's seminal intellectual achievements. This only confirms the wisdom of the Pope's proposal that Albert can serve as a model of how, as the Pope himself put it, science and faith can flourish harmoniously in men. Indeed, it's worth taking a quick look at a little bit of the apostolic letter of the Pope published in 1941. He says, "We're moved also by the sad state of affairs of our day when the latest advances of science are employed, unhappily, not for God's praise and man's salvation, but to visit the calamities of war even upon civilian centers and cities. May St. Albert, who in his own very difficult times proved by his wonderful work that science and faith can flourish harmoniously in men through his powerful intercession with God, arouse in the hearts and minds of those who devote themselves to the sciences to a peaceful and orderly use of the natural forces, the laws of which, divinely established, they investigate and seek after." Thank you.
It's the practice at the Gonzaga Socratic Club to have a respondent or commentator. In the case of this session, that commentator happens to be me. So I just want to note that most of Dr. Tkac's presentation was informational. However, seeing that he's my philosophical colleague, I'm not going to let him off the hook that easily. We're going to let's try to probe some of the philosophical issues that are behind the question of Albert's lack of recognition. So I have a couple of questions that I'd like for us all to think about. Perhaps Dr. Tkacz will have a comment on them, and then we'll have time for your questions. First thing, in the middle of your talk and toward the end, you came back to the question of Aristotle as a naturalistic philosopher, as articulating a naturalistic worldview. When you first brought it up, you noted that that worldview was not necessarily congenial because of the tendency in theological studies in the earlier medieval era was influenced so much by Neoplatonism and its tendency to divide the natural world from the supernatural world. And so it would be interesting to hear you address the question about why a naturalistic worldview, which in our own time is often used as a foil or a counter to a theistic worldview, why that's especially appropriate especially toward the end of your talk. You noted that it addresses the question of the unification of faith and reason. A second question, or maybe this is just an invitation, you noted on several occasions that Albert continued the empirical research project of Aristotle. You gave us a few, I would say, tantalizing examples, and it might be interesting to hear a little bit more about that, about the kind of descriptive empirical research that he did. So if you'd like to say something about that, that'd be interesting. Third point, I want to think about what a critic might say. The entire thrust of your talk has to do with what's so great about Albert. And your argument is that Albert plays a critical role in what we might call the medieval scientific revolution, this revival of an Aristotelian empirical natural project. However, I can imagine a critic saying the real scientific revolution occurs not in the 12th century, not in Albert's time, not as a result of the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, but it occurs several centuries later and has primarily to do with the move to mathematics and the move to quantification of natural phenomena that we find in thinkers like especially Descartes. And so I'd be curious to hear, why would you peg this revolution not at that later date, but at the earlier time of Albert the Great? And there's a related question I have to this that goes to the question of Albert's status. Great scientific innovators are in Western culture lionized. I might even metaphorically use the word and say canonized. If we think of scientific innovators like Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, and Einstein, why is it that despite Albert's undeniable, I would say, as a result of your talk, why is it that Albert's accomplishments and Albert's significance in the overall project of the study of nature in Western culture, why is it not acknowledged in the way that these other scientific innovators are? So those are some questions to consider perhaps in our conversation, or if you'd like to, Dr. Tkacz, say a word or two, you're certainly welcome to.
Well, where does one start? Let me address your last question first. The whole issue of when did the scientific revolution take place? As you know, we all know that the standard histories typically designate the early modern period, say roughly around the year 1600, during the lifetime of Galileo, as the time of the scientific revolution, beginning of modern science. And indeed, some older authors have gone so far as to say that before that time, not only was there not much progress in science, but people's way of looking at the world was pre-scientific, which is a polite way to say that they didn't know very much, right? And indeed, some, if you go back far enough, you find in the works of some scholars even a rather abusive way of talking about scientific knowledge of nature before Galileo. Right? I mean, the medievals are said to be superstitious, armchair speculators, and so forth. Right? Now, most of those claims made by historians of science had a lot more to do with the philosophical views of their own time than with research on what was actually going on in medieval intellectual life. Most of these people who made these claims, I'll just give you one example. The 18th century philosopher Auguste Comte was a contemporary of Immanuel Kant. Right? He was one of those who talked about the Middle Ages as a pre-scientific period, before human beings learned how to think scientifically. He has a word called the 3 ages of man. Right? So you got primitive, theological, and then scientific man. And of course, scientific man is the man of his own time, right? Himself and his contemporaries. Right? Now, the interesting thing about this is Comte gives us very little in the way of historical evidence for his thesis. His treatise is a philosophical treatise, right? He's defending a certain view of what science is, and so forth. So now, since World War II, there's been a great deal of research done in the scientific study of nature that took place before the time of Galileo. And in recent decades, this, the literature, the scholarly literature on this has expanded exponentially. And we now know that many of the claims made by thinkers coming out of the so-called Enlightenment of the 18th century were rather prejudiced, right? Not based on evidence, but based on their own views of their own time relative to earlier times. And no one takes somebody like Auguste Comte as a historian very seriously, not if you're a historian of science today. So the historical evidence speaks against this. Now, we don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but I'll just give you one sort of example. In fact, let me give you a kind of a school textbook example of the sort that we may all be familiar with. You know, it's sometimes said that it wasn't until the so-called Renaissance of the 15th and 16th century that painters learned how to paint in perspective. And the reason that they started to do all this work, paint their depictions with perspective is that they discovered scientifically the laws of perspective. And the medievals were ignorant. That's why the medievals painted these flat-looking depictions, right, with no background and no perspective. Figures seem to be floating in the middle of air and not grounded in a real perspective, and so forth. And maybe some of you remember some old art history books that say this. The ironic thing about it is that these so-called Renaissance painters of the 15th and 16th century, like, say, just take Leonardo as an example. He's one of the people who's sometimes cited as one of the discoverers of the laws of perspective. The way they learned the laws of perspective and the projective geometry upon which it is based was by reading medieval treatises on perspective. For example, Robert Grosseteste's book, De Perspectiva. Okay? Grosseteste was, and he did experiments in perspective. And if you actually look at the evidence, look at what Leonardo was reading, this is the stuff. This is where they got it. So it wasn't that the medievals were ignorant of the laws of perspective. Indeed, they were the ones who experimentally discovered them and worked them out and worked out the mathematics of them. And they were later used by later painters as a way of depicting perspective on a flat canvas. Okay? So, whatever the reasons that medieval painters didn't use it, turns out the reasons are theological, not ignorance of science, right? It had nothing to do with being ignorant of the laws of perspective, which were well known in the 13th century. We didn't have to wait till the 15th century or 16th century to get those laws of perspective. So that's one example. Now there are many more, even more profound scientific examples, but that's one that we all might be somewhat familiar with from our study of cultural history. So if you look at things like that, you begin to see that, well, there's real reason to maybe open our minds to the idea that science just was not sprung fully formed from the brow of Galileo like Hera from the brow of Zeus, right? Not quite. Indeed, Galileo, who indeed was a great scientific innovator and deserves his title, the father of modern science, right? So this has nothing to do with diminishing Galileo's contributions, but that Galileo was working in an already established tradition of experimental science. He wasn't initiating a tradition, as the older histories sometimes try to lead you to believe. And this is largely accepted by historians of science today. Indeed, I know of no serious, prominent historian of science who deals with either early modern science or medieval science who would make that claim today. Even if they wanted to say that, well, Tkacz is a little bit too strong on the medieval scientific revolution, and some might want to say that, they would not want to deny it altogether. The historical evidence is there. Now, I want to add just a note about the business about quantification, right? This idea that somehow the real scientific revolution came when we learned how to quantify the operations of nature, right? Well, when people say that, what they mean is not quantification, but mechanization. Now, they talk about quantification. They think they mean quantification, but in fact, they mean mechanization. And those are two different things. The fact of the matter is, mathematical physics was born in the Middle Ages. People like Robert Grosseteste, who were basically Platonists in their outlook, had the idea that what's intelligible about natural phenomena, natural things, and their operations and their properties, were their measurable aspects, and that therefore we need to reduce natural phenomena to what's measurable, and when we do that we can enumerate measurements, right? Because measurements are in numbers, either units or continuous quantities, and then we can operate, we can manipulate them and understand them in terms of the laws of mathematics. Now, this is not a modern idea. It's an ancient idea. It goes back to Plato's Academy. Right? How far Plato himself would have pushed that idea is a debate that scholars still have. But certainly, Plato had the idea and suggested it. And his nephew, who took over the Academy upon his death, Speusippus, was very much of that thought and wrote treatises on this. So this is a very ancient idea. This is not a modern idea. Galileo didn't invent this idea of the quantification of nature. And indeed, when Aristotle's science first came into the Latin West, early experimental researchers like Robert Grosseteste, because they were theologically devoted to a largely Platonic worldview, largely coming from the theological works of St. Augustine, tried to subsume Aristotle's natural science into the Platonic ontology by doing this kind of reduction to mathematical form. In other words, by quantification. So this idea, that reduction to quantification, is a medieval idea. It's not a modern idea. The difference between medieval science and early modern science is not one of, well, whether or not it's mathematical. No. And in fact, Galileo himself gave credit to the 14th century professors of natural philosophy at Merton College at Oxford as the great founders of mathematical physics. And indeed, there was a group of them who were very accomplished mathematicians of the day. Algebra had just become incorporated into the curriculum there. And they, and hence they were able to make calculations about the motion studies they were doing of various natural bodies. And Galileo gave these guys credit for founding that kind of science. It says, look, I owe this approach to the study of nature to the Mertonians, as they were called. Okay? And this is all well done. It's in Galileo's writings. That earlier historians sort of just downplayed these ideas because they were so committed to the idea that Galileo was really the crucial character here. Well, not quite. The historical evidence really shows that this is an idea that's been going on for a long time, and indeed research. So why is it then that people make such a big thing about quantification in early modern science? It was because of a real difference between medieval and modern science. The real difference was in the early modern period you had a much stronger emphasis on the notion that nature operates as a kind of great machine, right? It's like a big cosmic machine. It has discrete parts that exist discretely, particles, planets, whatever, however big or whatever the size of the parts are, and they interact with each other according to quantifiable, simple mechanical laws. A good example of this kind of mechanistic view of the universe is found in Newton's famous treatise, The Mathematical Principles of Nature, where he tries to work out how you could calculate various mechanical relationships among bodies in motion. Now, whether or not Newton was a mechanist, where he thought this was all there was to nature, is a debatable fact. But certainly, many of his followers were mechanists in this way. Kant, for example, was a committed mechanist. And of course, because the crucial factors in describing nature then are mechanical, and mechanical laws lend themselves easily to quantification, empirical studies were often seen as reducible to quantification. A medieval idea that goes back to the medieval Platonists at Oxford, like Robert Grosseteste and his many students, but an idea that was applied to the mechanization of the world picture in the early modern period. So the difference is not whether or not mathematics has a role in empirical studies. The difference is what role, right, and how you play it. One of the interesting things about Albert in particular in this connection is that Albert was very critical of, and I didn't have time to get into this, but Albert was very critical of his more platonically inclined contemporaries, like Robert Grosseteste and his followers at Oxford. He called them the Amici Platonists, the friends of Plato, and he criticized them in their empirical studies. He said, look, they're giving you a mere description of how natural phenomena appear. They're not telling you the true underlying causes of natural phenomena, what the real natures of natural things are. This can only be done by empirical study that uncovers the empirical laws that underlie natural substances, their attributes, and their operations. For example, Albert thought that such quantification could tell you nothing about how biological entities, organisms, exist and develop. At best, they can tell you, well, things get bigger at this rate, or something like that. But they can't tell you why things get bigger, why tomato plants grow and increase in size. What it is, what are the empirical factors of the way a tomato plant is put together that gives you growth? Or what are the factors that allows an animal to adapt to its environment? These cannot be explained simply by reducing what you observe to a measurable quantification of some kind. Now, Albert didn't deny that quantification can help us describe natural things, and they're part of the process of research, but they can't be the explanation itself. For this, you need empirical principles, and he held out for that. So the difference here, then, for Albert, and this is where he's revolutionary. See, without Albert, you wouldn't have such modern commonplaces in biological research as adaptation studies. Because he realized this is what Aristotle's talking about in his zoological treatises, and he worked out ways of observing this and cataloging various forms of organic adaptation, how organisms adapt to their environment. And it was only by ridding himself of the idea that the only way you get real science is by reducing it to quantification, by reducing it to numbers. No, you reduce it to the empirical explanations, like form follows function, right? The reason why certain biological organisms are formed like this is because they need to be formed like that in order to operate in a certain way. How do we know form follows function? Because we observe it over and over again in nature as we study nature and organisms and watch their development and their change and the way they exist in their natural environments and so forth. Okay? And this is not a matter of mathematics, even though mathematics can help us here and there in that enterprise.
Questions from the audience? Questions, comments?
First off, thank you very much, Dr. Tkacz, for your lecture. This is very informative. This might be a little off topic. I'm kind of stuck on the Galileo bit here. If we're going to say that when Galileo's doing his work, we're going to say that he's not initiating a new empirical research paradigm. That's fine. He's not bringing mathematics to the sciences. Okay. What then? I guess my question becomes: what is he doing that does seem to mark this dramatic shift that we see in the history of science? If it's not these ones that we've ruled out, what is it about his research program?
Well, that's a rather complex question that demands a book as an answer. But let me give you an example, okay? And perhaps that will give you an idea of the sort of thing. Certainly Galileo was a great scientific researcher and accomplished things that no one had accomplished before him. Many of the early experimental results in, say, in the study of the motion of, say, terrestrial bodies, things in the vicinity of the Earth and in the Earth's atmosphere and so forth. These studies that occurred in the Middle Ages, of course, were early studies, and the experiments themselves were, by modern standards, rather crude. And the reason they were rather crude is not because these guys were pre-scientific and didn't know how to do experiments, but it was because, of course, they didn't have sophisticated instrumentation to aid them in their observation, right? I mean, experimental science was just getting started, right? So clearly, there were things that they couldn't explain because they couldn't get a good enough look at them. And so sometimes they attempted explanation, and most of the medieval naturalists were very careful. They say, well, I'm not going to claim that I've demonstrated this, as we might say, proved it, but I'm going to say, look, here's a likely way that this makes sense because it works like this. Well, Galileo is responding in his own experimental work to a lot of these controversies, because you got these medieval guys that stand on, well, it's like this, no, it's more like this, you know, and they fight it out, okay? It was a dispute. Galileo was able, in his own time, largely because he was a brilliant mathematician, and was very good at developing observational techniques to improve our observation and measurement of motion in particular, so that he was able to resolve some of these old medieval controversies about motion. One of these, for example, this is a very famous one, was the whole notion of accelerated free fall motion, right? What happens in a freely falling body? So not a body that you force to move. You know, when you throw a baseball, that's what medievals call violent motion, right? Where you force a motion. If you just get out of the way of the baseball, it falls toward the surface of the earth, right? Okay, that's called free fall. Now, there was a big debate on is free fall motion accelerated? In other words, as something gets closer to the center of the earth, does it move faster and faster and faster? Or does it move in a uniform speed toward the center of the earth? It's hard to eyeball that, okay? Not only that, if it is an accelerated motion, how do you calculate the acceleration? Is the acceleration uniformly accelerated? In other words, that for every foot of free fall, you get this amount of acceleration and speed and so forth, right? Well, in fact, medieval scholastic philosophers in the universities in the late Middle Ages did a lot of experiments on this. One famous was another Dominican by the name of Domenico di Soto, who was on the theology faculty at the University of Salamanca in Spain, and later taught in Rome. He came up with the idea of a constant form of acceleration at a certain rate. So things got faster and faster, but at a uniform rate. And Galileo knew de Soto's work very well and used it as the basis for his inclined plane experiments, where he was finally able to work out what exactly is the ratio of acceleration. And of course, we now know that Galileo solved the problem, right? And it's because he was able to experimentally design an experiment in an innovative way, in a way that was an improvement on de Soto's earlier experiments, and he was able to calculate the rate of motion in a way that was more sophisticated than the mathematical methods used by de Soto. And so he solved this problem by an advance. But you see, he's not starting experimental science, he's building on previous experiments, right? Like a lot of scientific research does. Almost all scientific research is like that, right? But he clearly does something innovative that solves the problem. So now we know that bodies freely falling through Earth's atmosphere fall at a rate of 32 feet per second, right? Okay, assuming there's no friction and so forth, right? And Galileo was able to show that and establish that. Indeed, he was able to scientifically demonstrate it. And this is an interesting point in connection with the comments I made earlier about the recovery of Aristotle's scientific method. Galileo shows that he's able to demonstrate this in precisely the way that Aristotle says it needs to be demonstrated if it is to be an established scientific law. Right? Now, we can't go into the nature of demonstration here, that would take a whole class to explain. But it's a logical technique, okay? And Aristotle is the source of it. But Galileo's appealing to Aristotle and his methodology, which Galileo knows well and is using. And the inclined plane experiment and his explanation for the uniform acceleration of falling bodies is a good example. So that's one example of the kind of thing. Does that help? Anyone else? To research the intellectual life in a way that was not subservient to some other end. In a way, say, the monastic schools. I mean, the monks did real intellectual work in the early medieval monasteries, to be sure. Great work was done, and real teaching and learning went on. But of course, the monasteries were always and primarily religious institutions. And whatever work was done, intellectual work was done in the monasteries, ultimately had to fit with that, religious mission of the monastery. And so there was limits on how much leeway and support one could get for purely intellectual activity. This is one of the reasons why most of the advanced study in monasteries was largely theological. They dealt with theological questions. So they didn't get into the study of nature and so forth. that much. Well, it's not surprising given the nature. And the same thing with the court schools, both in the Christian and in the Islamic world. There were limitations. In the university, you didn't have those kinds of limitations. The whole point of being in the university was to be free to do intellectual work, to do investigations of whatever there is out there to know. And given that, it's not surprising that once you receive the body of scientific knowledge of the study of nature, and this piques your interest, well, you were working in an institution where you were free to pursue that without bumping into other obligations you had, right? In quite the same way you had in earlier institutional settings for intellectual life. So in that sense, it certainly was a spur to scientific investigation. I mean, I suppose one could make a parallel with, I mean, there's a difference between the way chemistry is done in the university and the way it's done in the drug company, right? They're both doing real chemistry, to be sure. They're both making contributions to the discipline. But in a drug company, by and large, the work is oriented to developing drugs that the company can sell, right? I mean, because that's why the institution exists, for that purpose. So you can't just, the chemists there just can't do whatever they want, right? They can't do research or whatever they want. There are limits, right? And they have to adjust what they're doing to the mission. Whereas in the university, well, the whole point of the institution is intellectual inquiry. So you can get into areas of chemistry that perhaps you couldn't do in the lab, you know, at Abbott Labs or something like that, okay? And I think it's parallel to that sort of situation.
Well, there's plenty more discussion, questions we could have, but we are out of time. If you'd like to stick around and chat, please do so. Let's thank Dr. Tkacz again.
Thanks very much.